When you think of a prophet, you probably imagine someone who can predict the future. After all, that's what a prophecy is, right? A foretelling of future events? Or is it? As you'll soon discover, the reality is more complex than you can possibly imagine, such that Jesus describes probably the last person we would expect as a prophet, Abel. Yes, from the story of Cain and Abel. In just a moment, we will be looking at the passages where Jesus says this, but possibly the most ironic thing about this is that when you read through Genesis 4, where the story of Cain and Abel takes place, Abel does not say a single word. Forgive me, but what? If nothing else, a prophet speaks. How can a man who never said a single word possibly be considered a prophet? That's the question we're going to answer today. First, we're going to examine the passages where Jesus says this about Abel. Second, we're going to build out a profile of the prophetic institution in the ancient world. Third, we're going to see how Abel fits into that prophetic institution. And then fourth, we're going to examine some life-transforming takeaways. I became interested in this topic a couple of years ago while watching a Mike Winger Q&A. A viewer asked if Abel should be considered a prophet based on the passages that we're looking at today. And I can't get into everything in this video, but my research interests include things like the prophetic voice, the intercessory voice, divine judgment, and sacred space. The story of Cain and Abel is an intersection point for all of those topics. So, needless to say, I have been thinking about this question and these ideas ever since that. Now, Mike was speaking extemporaneously in a live Q&A. So while he did his best to answer the question, I do think that there's more that we can go into, much more, as we're going to see here. That's why we're going to take a deep dive to answer this question today. I'll include a link to Mike's video in the description of this video. The main passage where this question comes from is Luke 11:47 through 51. Now, in this passage, Jesus is having a meal at a Pharisee's house. In the context, Jesus delivers 6 woes to those who are present at that meal. A woe is a proclamation of forthcoming suffering. So you can think of it like, what sorrow awaits you? So we see Jesus say that 6 times in this passage, and it's something to the effect of, what sorrow awaits you? And he delivers 3 of these woes to the Pharisees, and then 3 of these woes to the experts in the law. The 5th woe is the subject of our discussion here. In Luke 11:47 through 51, we read, "Woe to you, for you build the tombs of the prophets whom your fathers killed. So you are witnesses, and you consent to the deeds of your fathers, for they killed them, and you build their tombs. Therefore also the wisdom of God said, I will send them prophets and apostles, some of whom they will kill and persecute, so that the blood of all the prophets shed from the foundation of the world may be charged against this generation, from the blood of Abel to the blood of Zechariah, who perished between the altar and the sanctuary. Yes, I tell you, it will be required of this generation." There's also a parallel passage to this in Matthew 23:29 through 36. Now, that passage often comes up because of a question of accuracy about the second prophet named there. That is Zechariah, the son of Berechiah. We don't see the reference to the son of Berechiah in the Luke passage, but we do in the Matthew passage. That is an interesting discussion in its own right, but not the subject of this video. So I'll put a link in the description of a video that Inspiring Philosophy made that deals with that question in particular. But unfortunately, the commentaries that I've read speak to the issue about Zechariah, the son of Berechiah, but in no wise speak of Abel as a prophet. He's often described as the first martyr, but no further comment is made about him. Jesus clearly includes Abel as a prophet, though, and that's particularly the case in the Luke passage, where he says that the blood of all the prophets shed from the foundation of the world may be charged against this generation, from the blood of Abel to the blood of Zechariah. The blood of the prophets, the blood of Abel. It's clear that Jesus is including Abel among the prophets. Honestly, though, at first blush, Abel seems like one of the least significant characters in all of the Bible. He's only mentioned by name in 4 books of the Bible. We've already mentioned 3 of those. That's Genesis, in Genesis 4, where the story first takes place, Luke, and then the parallel passage in Matthew 23. And then we're going to discuss the final book that he appears in later in this video. But even in Genesis, he's referred to, and he doesn't say a single word. He gets murdered, and then he's never mentioned again in the entire Old Testament. So again, we ask, how can a man who never said a single word be considered a prophet? To answer this, it's important to develop a prophetic profile from the ancient world. If this nerdy stuff isn't your thing, I totally understand. Feel free to skip to the next chapter in the video where I will give my interpretation of how Jesus understands Abel as a prophet. But establishing the prophetic institution really is the meat and potatoes of this video and what I spent most of my research on. So I do hope that you'll check it out. The relevant Greek word that Jesus uses in Luke 11 is prophetes. However, Jesus is discussing Old Testament examples. So rather than digging into the use and etymology of the word prophetes, it is expedient to spend our time focusing on those Old Testament examples and an ancient concept of the prophetic institution. In the Old Testament, several terms are given to refer to the prophets. There's the term hosa in Greek, that is translated visionary. There is the term roa, which is translated seer. There is the term Ish Elohim or Ishet Elohim, and that would be either man of God or woman of God. And then finally, there is the technical term that we often think of when we think of prophet, and that's Navi. Not much can be gleaned from the etymology of these words either. Perhaps there was originally some conception of how the prophet received revelation that was in view with these words, but this frankly just is not clear. For example, being a seer seems to pertain more to the abstract idea of knowledge than receiving visions or something like that. Similar to how we would use the term I see today, and we don't literally mean seeing something with our eyes. We mean that we understand. We mean that we can understand the knowledge. And for a word like Navi, we don't even know where this word comes from. We don't even have a full grasp on what the etymology is. Perhaps it comes from Akkadian and has reference to calling, whether being called by God or calling out a message, but really we don't know. Thus, a primary definition of each of these words and terms is not going to give us the prophetic profile that we're looking to establish. As David Schreiner notes, the Old Testament suggests that the prophetic office cannot be reduced to any single term. So then, what is a prophet? Hill and Walton note that a prophet is someone who speaks on behalf of someone else. This is important because it means that a prophet is not necessarily speaking on behalf of God, and a prophet is not necessarily predicting the future. The prophet is defined as speaking, though. So Abel, the notoriously mute, isn't quite fitting this description. So let's keep digging. As Christopher Hayes puts it, prophecy is a form of divination, a way for humans to make known the will of God or the gods. Really? Is that how we're doing it? Is that the play? Now is a great time to expand our understanding of the role of prophecy in the ancient world. Much of our understanding of prophecy obviously comes from how the office is revealed in the Old Testament. In addition to this, 55 of the over 25,000 texts discovered at Mari also help elucidate the prophetic institution. As Hayes notes, prophecy is just one form of divination practiced in the ancient world. Silly kitty. Silly kitty. What you doing? Divination is the art or science of deducing the future or the unknown through the observation and interpretation of some facet of nature or human life, ordinarily of an unpredictable and trivial character. Methods of divination are broadly broken down into two categories: inductive or artificial, and intuitive or natural. Stop it. Chugga. Chugga, 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 chugga. Chugga, 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 chugga. Can't you go to your chugga chair? Could you go to your chugga chair? You are interrupting. But you're so cute. You're so cute. You're so cute. Inductive divination involves the observation and interpretation of signs and omens according to technical methods. Examples include oneromancy, which is the interpretation of dreams, claromancy, which is the casting of lots, and similarly astragomancy, which is the rolling of dice, belomancy, which has something to do with the use of arrows. Hey, Harlequin, tell me, how far does this go? What do you mean you weren't looking? You can literally only look that direction. Rhabdomancy, which somehow involves a staff or rod. Augury, which is the flight of birds. They're flying east today. We ride tonight. Oh, they're flying west today. You better stay home, King. Hydromancy, which involves putting various substances into water and seeing how they react, or similarly, economancy, which is the pouring of oil into water to seeing how the oil interacts with the water on the surface of the water and interpreting that. Extipacy, this is the examining of animal entrails, and particularly hepatoscopy, which is the examining of the liver. Hey, Dragon, how do you feel about me cutting out your liver and seeing what it divines for me? Do dragons even have livers? Astrology, which was the examination of heavenly bodies like stars and planets. Teraphim, which would be the examination of various cultic images. Necromancy, which would be contacting the dead, either through a medium who the dead would speak through, or through conjuring up a spirit. And predetermined signs and omens. Now, this would be making decisions based on predetermined events that might occur. So saying, if so-and-so does this, then that means that the gods want me to do that. But if they do this, then it means the gods want me to do that. Each of these forms of divination relied only on proper training and skill. The will of the gods was objectively knowable through technical observation and interpretation. Prophecy, on the other hand, is an example of intuitive divination, where the diviner is given direct knowledge. I'm trying to talk about intuitive divination. I'm trying to talk about prophecy. Why? Why don't you go to your chaga chair? No, you do not need to speak into the microphone. You do not need to speak into the microphone. Hi. Don't bat me in the face. I don't want your... Don't bite my nose either. Sheesh. Ow. Yowza. Okay. Ow. Yowza. Palooza. Ow. Yowza. Okay. Each of these forms of... Yowza. Prophecy, on the other hand, is an example of intuitive divination, where the diviner is given direct knowledge, often through trance, ecstatic episodes, visions, or some other means of inspiration. Because of the subjective nature of prophecy, it appears that while prophecy was attested among Israel's neighbors, it was secondary to the more clearly applicable inductive methods. This is what makes the prophetic institution in Israel distinctive, because most, if not all, of those inductive methods of divination were outlawed by the Lord. So things like necromancy, extipacy, all of those kinds of things were not allowed according to the law of the Lord. This caused the prophetic institution to have greater prominence in Israelite culture. As we've already seen, that prominence doesn't always mean that the prophets were respected. Often they were persecuted and even martyred for their troubles. But this brings up how prophets functioned in the ancient world. As we have already noted, prophets spoke on behalf of someone else. In some cases, this meant functioning as an advisor to the king. In other cases, it meant delivering propaganda to bolster the authority of the king. And in still other cases, it meant chastising and correcting the king or other individuals or groups who have done evil. Generally speaking, the biblical prophets either functioned centrally in close geographic relationship to a monarch, or they functioned peripherally, more on the outskirts of society and in opposition to a given monarch. The message of the prophets could either be one of blessing or of judgment, often both contingent on the obedience or the disobedience of the recipients of that message. So if you listen to the message of the prophets and you obey what they're telling you from the Lord, then there will be blessing. However, if you ignore the message of the prophets and you disobey, then there's going to be consequences, judgment, and curses. Again, there is complexity here, as it appears that the prophetic office in ancient Israel developed over time. As Hill and Walton note, there are three major stages in the development of the prophetic institution. The first stage of development, known as the pre-monarchy stage, sees the prophet as the primary leader of the people. During this stage, God is positioned as the king over the people, and the prophet is his mouthpiece for guiding the people. This type of prophetic role is not attested in other cultures in the ancient Near East. The second stage of this development, known as the pre-classical stage, looks quite similar to that of ancient Israel's neighbors. During this stage of development, the prophetic role is primarily as central advisor or peripheral voice of correction for the king. The third stage in development of the biblical prophetic institution, known as the classical stage, sees the prophet as directing his message to the people, calling for social reforms or warning of impending judgment. During this final stage, prophetic writing became especially significant. That final aspect of the prophetic institution is important to develop. That is the topic of historiography or history writing. This was important generally speaking in the ancient world. As Schreiner notes, first, prophets spontaneously uttered their messages as a result of experiencing some type of divine inspiration. This is similar to what one reads in the Old Testament, as when the word of the Lord would come to the prophets. Second, prophetic messages at Mari are linked to a conscious mission or course of action. That is, the prophetic message reaches beyond mere information to serve a larger purpose, a larger message. In other words, there was an assumption and expectation that the culturally and contextually determined message of the prophet would be beneficial beyond the immediate need of the moment. The message would be beneficial and edifying to future readers. The notion that the prophetic writings were written contemporaneously with the events in which they record is somewhat simplistic and probably inaccurate. That said, the commitment of biblical authors to preserve the teachings of the prophets is unparalleled in the ancient world. It is worth noting the significance of this practice. The oracle of the prophet, delivered orally, was a contextually determined message, appropriate to particular events at a given time in history. Recording, compiling, editing, and disseminating these oracles in the form of a literary work implies a profound belief that these contextually bound messages had a broader meaning for instruction, correction, and encouragement in covenant faithfulness to God. The mostly anonymous scribes who undertook this process labored extensively to preserve their prophetic writings, their history, and their Torah for the edification of those who would come after them. This commitment to history writing and prophetic writing opens the door for the character, covenant, and commands of the Lord to be preserved and contextualized to all people at all times. So to review, prophecy is a form of divination. Divination can either be inductive or intuitive. Prophecy is intuitive. It involves the prophet receiving direct knowledge and revealing that knowledge through oracles, often spoken, but sometimes written. The prophet either functioned centrally or peripherally, either advising and bolstering or chastising a monarch. Eventually, the prophetic office developed such that the message was directed to the people rather than to the monarch. The message consisted of proclaiming blessings for obedience and curses or judgment for disobedience. Now that we have established a profile for the prophetic office, let us return to the question at hand. How can a man who never said a word be considered a prophet? Well, I think Jesus had a particular idea in mind when he said what he said about Abel. And I think this is particularly evident in Jesus referring to the blood of Abel. Let's go back to Genesis 4 and see what Genesis records about Abel. Now, it is true that the Bible doesn't record a single word from Abel's mouth, but that doesn't mean that Abel doesn't speak. How is that possible? Well, if we look at Genesis 4:8, we read, Cain spoke to Abel his brother, and when they were out in the field, Cain rose up against his brother Abel and killed him. Then the Lord said to Cain, Where is Abel your brother? He said, I do not know. Am I my brother's keeper? And the Lord said, What have you done? The voice of your brother's blood is crying to me from the ground. And now you are cursed from the ground, which has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. When you work the ground, it shall no longer yield to you its strength. You shall be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth. I think this idea here of the voice of your brother's blood is crying to me from the ground is the institution of the prophetic voice in the Bible. Remember, one of the aspects of what a prophet was supposed to do was to declare judgment, was to declare the message of God, particularly and often when people were doing evil, when people were doing things that were wrong. And here we have the very first instance of a person rising up against another person and harming them, doing evil against them, and particularly murdering them. Cain murders his brother Abel, and he no longer can speak. He no longer can say anything, yet his blood speaks from the ground, and the message that it speaks is one of judgment. It's crying out to the Lord for God to act in the course of history to make right what has been wrong. And that is a major facet of the prophetic office, seeing evil that is done and speaking out against that evil, calling people to account and letting them know that that's essentially what Abel's blood is doing. It's crying out a message of judgment against Cain, his brother, who murdered him. Now I want to examine some life-transforming takeaways related to this topic. Remember how I said that there is a fourth book that speaks about Abel? That is the book of Hebrews. And in the book of Hebrews, we further elucidate and we further illumine this idea of Abel being a prophet, and we also are reminded of the Lord Jesus and what he has done for us. So Abel is actually mentioned twice in the book of Hebrews. He's first mentioned in Hebrews 11 in what is often called the Hall of Faith chapter. In Hebrews 11:4, we read, By faith Abel offered to God a more acceptable sacrifice than Cain, through which he was commended as righteous, God commending him by accepting his gifts. And through his faith, though he died, he still speaks. So here we see, Abel still speaks even now, even today, through his faith. So he doesn't speak with any words. Again, we don't have any recorded words from Abel. Yet we see that he still speaks. Why? Because he's a prototype of righteousness. He is the one who did nothing wrong and still acted righteously, and yet was persecuted for his righteousness and was ultimately killed for his righteousness. And he still speaks today through his righteous example. But Hebrews goes a little bit deeper into this. In Hebrews 12:22 through 24, we get a little bit more on Abel. And this is in the context of discussing the Israelites at Mount Sinai during the Exodus narrative, and how they're receiving instruction, they're receiving Torah, they're receiving the Ten Commandments from the Lord. And the writer of Hebrews is appropriating that to his readers, and he says this: "But you have come to Mount Zion, and to the city of the living God." So not Mount Sinai, but Mount Zion. They've come to the heavenly Jerusalem, and to innumerable angels in festal gathering, and to the assembly of the firstborn who are enrolled in heaven, and to God, the judge of all, and to the spirits of the righteous made perfect, and to Jesus, the mediator of a new covenant, and to the sprinkled blood that speaks a better word than the blood of Abel. Wow. So here we see a reference to the blood of Abel speaking. Well, what did the blood of Abel speak? Well, he couldn't speak anything other than judgment against his brother Cain, because Cain murdered him. That's all that was left for Cain, was a message of judgment from his brother Abel, who became the first prophet in that sense. That became the institution of the prophetic voice calling out against evil. But here we see in Hebrews that Jesus' blood speaks a better word than the blood of Abel. Why? Because it's not a message of judgment. It's not a message of condemnation. Where Abel was murdered unwillingly by his brother, Jesus willfully laid down his life as a sacrifice for our sins so that we can be made right with God. So the voice of Jesus' blood, the message of Jesus' blood, is one of hope, is one of reconciliation, is one of being made right with God. So when we come to Jesus, it's not like Cain, who had to be cursed from the ground, who had to be sent away in exile. Rather, we come to Jesus and we receive citizenship in his kingdom. We are able to come near to Mount Zion. We are able to be citizens in the heavenly Jerusalem. We don't have to fear for judgment. We don't have to fear for condemnation, because he is the mediator of the new covenant whereby we can be reconciled to God. So I hope this video was helpful to you. I hope that it built on your understanding of what a prophet is. Is a prophet a mere fortune teller? No, I don't think so. I think that it's a much more complicated picture than that, and I think that the words of Jesus testify to that fact. May God bless you.